Welcome everybody. Again, my name is Abe Lloyd. This is the first we've seen, or you've seen me, I guess, and I'm here at Deception Pass State Park, and I'm going to be taking you on a field trip digitally, virtually, since I can't take you here in person. And Deception Pass is really a wonderful spot to study our conifers because all of our lowland conifers are found on West Beach here at Deception Pass. So my goal for this field trip is to introduce you to the conifers, give you an overview of how our book works and some useful tools that are built into this book, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, and talk about some of the ethnobotanical uses of our lowland conifers. So you could see the West Beach in the background here, beautiful day, we could see the Olympic Mountains in the distance. And then over here is kind of a dune complex that is overgrown with trees, and we have all the conifers here: Douglas fir, grand fir, spruce, pine, juniper, you name it, it's here. So this is really going to be a great spot for learning those organisms. Now, if you want, you can download the field trip form and come here when the park reopens and work through that form on your own, or just take the form and go to another park and try and find the trees. And I really recommend that as a good way to study those trees, because you will be accountable for identifying these species from a photograph and providing an ethnobotanical use. So let's dive right in. I want to say a few words about our textbook, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast. Now, a lot of people call this book simply Pojar and McKinnon, and it's universally regarded throughout this region as one of the best field identification books. But Pojar and McKinnon are, while they are authors, they're also the editors, and there really are more than just two authors. There's actually 10 different authors. They're all experts in their field. And one of them, Nancy Turner, I've assigned several other readings and text from her, and because she provides the ethnobotanical accounts for this book. Now, I want to say a bit about how the book is organized. And we'll be studying some of the terminology I'm going to give you. We'll be studying in more detail in a second. But the book starts out with, after the introduction, it starts out with trees. And this book is organized by life form. And so trees are a major type of life form, and they're going to be at the beginning. So you find them here in purple. After the trees come shrubs in orange, and then after the shrubs come herbaceous plants, which are non-woody flowering plants. And towards the end we have things like grasses and ferns and mosses and lichens. But for now we're just studying the trees, so you could know that if you go out into the field to practice some of these tree identifications, you could find all the trees right at the very beginning of the book in this purple section. And within each of the color-coded sections, the plants are then organized taxonomically, so plants that often look more similar and are closely related will be close together in the book. So for example, there are several types of true firs, and they're going to be in consecutive pages in this book. This book has a few different tools built into it for identifying plants. And you know, there's a lot to be said for actually just thumbing through all the different pages, say all the different tree pages, and looking at the photos and reading the descriptions and trying to identify something. So probably the easiest tool, although sometimes maybe tedious, is just to thumb through the pages, match pictures, and read the descriptions. So that's one good method, and you're going to gain a lot of image recognition by doing that. So the more trees you identify by that method, probably the easier it will be to identify ones in the future. Another tool that's built into this book is something called a dichotomous key, and we're going to be using the dichotomous key because, again, it's going to teach you something about the plant. So the dichotomous key uses some vocabulary that botanists use, and because this class is, focused on botany as well, I want you to learn some of that vocabulary. So within the trees, we really have two different types of trees. There are evergreen trees that have needle-like leaves, and there are broadleaf trees or deciduous trees that have broad leaves that usually fall off. So the evergreen trees are called evergreen because they generally keep their needles all year long, or the leaves all year long, whereas the broadleaf or deciduous trees, most of them will lose their leaves. Evergreens are also called conifers because they bear cones. So here we could see some cones, all right? Whereas, and they reproduce by seeds that are naked, so they're also called gymnosperms, which technically means naked seed. And again, to contrast with the broadleaf or deciduous trees, the deciduous trees reproduce with flowers and seeds that are coated with a layer, so they're not naked. So those are the conifers. I mean the deciduous trees versus the conifers. Okay, so going back to the key, dichotomous keys are essentially decision trees. They provide the reader with two options. That's why it's dichotomous. Di means two. And so they're like a couplet, and we have to choose which of the two options fits best. So the way this particular key is organized, each part of the couplet starts with the same number and is designated by either an A or a B. So the beginning, it says 1A, and we're going to compare what it says under 1A with over here where it says 1B. All right? And if 1A matches best, then we're going to go to 2A and compare that to 2B. But if on this key, if 1B matched best, then we would go right below it and compare 14A with 14B. Read 1A first. It says, leaves needle-like or scale-like, evergreen, seeds usually in cones, not enclosed in a fruit. The conifers. Okay, so that's 1A, and 1B says, leaves broad and except for arbutus, annually deciduous, seed enclosed in a fruit. So we know those are the deciduous trees. Okay, so 1A is our correct option if we're trying to key out this conifer, this evergreen conifer right here. Okay, so now I'm going to go to 2A and compare it to 2B. Leaves scale-like, concealing the twigs. That's 2A, and 2B reads, leaves needle-like, not concealing the twigs. Now you haven't seen a scale-like leaf yet, and maybe I'll key that one out yet next. But these leaves are very needle-like, which, you know, a needle is skinny and sharp on the tip and long. So this is a classic needle-like leaf. So we can choose 2B, leaves needle-like. So that brings us down to comparing 4A to 4B. 4A reads needles in clusters, and 4B reads needles not in clusters. So if I go and pull off a single needle, I only get a single needle. Now if the needles were in clusters and I tried to pull off a single needle, I would actually end up with several needles. So that's how you know if it's a cluster or not. So we can go with 4B, needles not in clusters. That brings us to 6A, needles stalkless, or 6B, needles stalked. So again, we need to take a close look at where the needle is attaching to the twig. So let's do that now. This twig here is a good place to look for stalks or not. You can see some of the needles have fallen off. And you see all those little bumps? Well, it turns out those are the leftover needle stalks. So each needle grows off of a little appendage on the twig right there, and that's the stalk. So there are two ways that a needle can be stalked. It can either be stalked where the stalk stays on the twig, as we see here, or it can be stalked where the needle itself has a stalk, and when the needle falls, the stalk goes with the needle. Now, even though they're evergreen, they do still lose their needles. They just don't lose them every year. One of these needles will last maybe 3 or 4 years, and then it'll fall off usually at a different time than the one next to it will fall off. And so at no point will the tree, most of our conifers will at no point be totally bare without needles unless they're actually dead. There are a few exceptions, of course. Okay, so let's see, we decided that the needles have stalks, so we chose 6B, and now we're going to go down and compare 10A with 10B. So 10A reads, stalks fall with needles, hey, what do you know? Seed cones with prominent three-pronged bracts. And 10B reads, stalks or part of them remain after needles fall. Seed cones not as above. Okay, so this is a great, this is a well-written key, and oftentimes keys will give us descriptions of more than one feature. So we saw that the 10 couplet gives us descriptions of the stalks on the needles as well as something about the cones. So we know that the stalks remain on the twig when the needle falls, and so that's one reason we could choose 10B. And the other one talks about the cone, and let's see, here's a cone. So are there scale-like features, or are there bracts rather under each scale of the cone? So these are the cone scales that we see, and there are no bracts tucked up under each of those cone features. So it's not 10A for two reasons. So we can move on to, let's see, below 10B is 11A. We're getting close. 11 couplet. 11A reads, needles four-sided, stiff, sharp-pointed. And 11B reads, needles two-sided, not stiff. So a two-sided needle, a lot of our conifers have two-sided needles. And a two-sided needle is flat enough that you can't really roll it with your fingers. Now this one here, I could roll in between my fingers, and that's because it's actually four-sided. Sided needles, the last confirming character is whether or not it is, if the needles are sharp-pointed or blunt-tipped. Ow! They're actually quite sharp-pointed. So both features of 11A match. The needles are four-sided, they're also stiff and sharp-pointed. So it tells us now that it is Picea sitchensis. And I could flip back until I find Picea sitchensis. Here we go, and it'll give me the common name as well, Sitka spruce. So I think a good mnemonic for remembering Sitka spruce, and a very good feature, are those sharp-pointed needles. And so I often say, never make a truce with a spruce, because when you go to shake its hand, it bites you right away, it stabs you right away. So this is our Sitka spruce, and I want to say a bit about its ethnobotany, since that's the subject of this course. Sitka spruce is typically found close to salt water for us, and that's because Sitka spruce doesn't tolerate prolonged drought, and we tend to have dry summers further away from the coast, but close to the coast there's a lot of fog that comes in and keeps these spruce trees a little bit more moist during the summer. And Sitka spruce also does not tolerate big fluctuations in temperature. And the ocean holds a lot of heat, and so it releases that heat slowly during the winter time and keeps the trees a little bit warmer than areas further from the coast. And then during the summertime, the water's a lot colder, and so it keeps the maritime fringe much cooler during the summer. Okay, so some ethnobotany related to Sitka spruce. Super important tree, and it has a number of uses. One that now is a perfect time for, you see these little buds here? These will burst out with a whole bunch of young needles in about a month. But at this stage, you can actually eat them a little bit like berries. They're pretty piney tasting, but they're edible. So, and this isn't so much a traditional use, but kind of more of a wild food use. Sitka spruce trees are really pitchy, and the pitch, you can collect the pitch and boil it a little bit, heat it up, and then put it on things, mix it with charcoal, put it on things, and use it as a glue. So this might be something, if you need a glue for your ethnobotany project, Sitka spruce sap is a good tree for making glue. And the sap is also used medicinally for a wide range of ailments, and one in particular is the antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. You could just put it right onto a wound and it'll heal that wound more quickly. I think though one of the most important uses of Sitka spruce are the long roots. And I'm going to try and find a spot where I can get to the base of the tree more easily and dig down and show you just how long and straight the roots are. And these long straight roots are excellent for basket weaving. And in some parts, such as the further north, the Tlingit, they actually traditionally weave these hats out of spruce roots that are so tightly woven that they're waterproof. And further south, it's common for, in this area, the Coast Salish area, it's common for people to make baskets out of Sitka spruce roots and cedar roots that are so tightly woven that you could actually cook inside of a basket, fill it up with water, add hot rocks until the water boils, and then you could cook a soup inside of a tightly woven basket. So pretty amazing Sitka spruce. Go. Sitka spruce bark is pretty distinctive, and I often recognize the trees by the bark alone. So next to me here is a nice Sitka spruce, and you can see how the bark flakes in these chunks that I think look a little bit like potato chips. So just imagine eating one of these like a potato chip. That's the Sitka spruce. It'll be a little tedious for me to key out every single tree that I want you to learn in today's field trip. I would have you do that as a way of practicing, but I'm not going to do this for all the trees on video. But I'm going to key out one more. So let's see. Leaves needle-like or scale-like, evergreen, seeds usually in cones. 1A or 1B, leaves broad and deciduous. So what do you think? Ah, good choice. Yes, you're right. It has needle-like leaves, so it must be 1A. 2A, leaves scale-like, concealing the twigs, or leaves needle-like, not concealing the twigs. They're needle-like. They look pretty darn similar to those spruce needles from a distance. So we go down to 4. 4A reads needles in clusters, and 4B reads needles not in clusters. So I'll pull off one of those needles and we'll see what happens. Ouch! All right, sure enough, just one needle came with it. So, shouldn't have lost my page, so that means we go to 4B. All right, so below that is 6. 6A reads needle stalkless. 6B reads needle stalked. I'm gonna have to take you a little closer to see that. So, sure enough, we got a little stalk on this needle. So we choose 6B. Below 6B, we have 10. 10A reads stalks fall with needles, seed cones with prominent 3-pronged bracts. And 10B reads stalks or part of them remain after needles fall, seed cones not as above. So I do see a stalk that's on the needle as opposed to on the twig, which we saw in the Sitka spruce. So that means the stalks are falling with the needles when they fall. And now we need to find a cone. Oh, here's a cone. How convenient. And well, look at that. Looks like between each of the scales there is a 3-pronged bract. Amazing! Yay! So we have Douglas fir! Woo! Oh, well, so we have Pseudotsuga menziesii, and thumb through here, I find that Pseudotsuga menziesii is Douglas fir. We did it! This is a seed cone. There are actually 2 different types of cones on conifers, seed cones and pollen cones. And this low-hanging branch provides us a good look at the seed cones as well as these little teeny cones which are called pollen cones. So around this time of the year, maybe not right now though, pollen will shake out of those cones and cause people to sneeze and give them runny eyes and things like that, runny nose and dry eyes. You could also see that there are some young seed cones developing. So these cones here, this is last year's seed cone, and this here is this year's, will mature into this year's seed cone. Now Douglas fir cones, Douglas fir trees produce cones prolifically, and they are often shaken out of the trees by winter storms, and it's pretty easy to identify a Douglas fir tree just by walking underneath it, and you almost always see, look at this, all these Douglas fir cones everywhere. If you were to have a pine cone fight, you would want to build your fort underneath a Douglas fir cone, tree. Douglas fir bark is deeply furrowed, and it gives it some fire resistance. And here we can see the deep furrows and ridges on the Douglas fir bark, and this bark is super thick, and you know, when there's a fire, there's a lot of heat, and the thickness of the bark insulates the living tissue that's underneath the bark from the heat. Now, it's possible for a Douglas fir tree in a really intense fire to die, but generally Douglas fir trees are a fire-adapted species that can tolerate a lot of heat on their bark. Douglas fir trees are dominant throughout the Puget lowlands, and if you go to a park near your house, chances are most of the trees in the park are going to be Douglas fir trees. And Douglas fir trees are also a very valuable commercial timber species, and so that's a modern ethnobotanical use for them. And they have one of the highest strength to weight ratios of any tree in the Pacific Northwest, and actually in North America. And for that reason, Douglas fir trees are often planted outside of their natural range because foresters value the wood a lot. In fact, David Douglas, for whom the Douglas fir tree is named after, he in the 1820s, when he came to North America, just 20 years after Lewis and Clark came overland to the coast, he saw these giant trees upwards of 300 feet tall with really straight trunks, and he recognized that they were would be an important timber species for the British who were employing him. So he sent seeds back to England, and today Douglas fir trees are still planted as a valuable forest crop outside of their native range in England. Because of its strength to weight ratio, here on the coast, Coast Salish peoples and other Northwest Coast Native Americans and indigenous peoples valued the wood for things like spear shafts and harpoon shafts because it's really strong and relatively light. Behind me here is another evergreen tree or shrub. I think this one actually might be in the shrub section of the book, but you're going to need to know it for the tree quiz because I like to lump it more as a tree. And I'll talk about the difference between the different life forms next week in our lecture. But this here is called seaside juniper, and it's actually endemic to the Puget Sound. It's found mostly on the islands, and here we are on Fidalgo Island. This one here, instead of having needle-like leaves, it actually has scale-like leaves. So just you can see how they're not long and linear. They look kind of like somebody took and folded a leaf around a twig, like making a dolma. You'd fold a grape leaf around rice. Well, here the juniper leaf has been folded around the twig. Junipers are used for all sorts of different things. They have a nice smell. Sometimes they're in potpourri today. And you may have heard that gin is made from juniper berries. Gin isn't actually fermented juniper berries. Gin is vodka that has been steeped in juniper berries, or juniper berries that have been steeped in vodka make gin, rather. One more evergreen that isn't really a tree, but it might show up on your tree quiz, is this another type of juniper called common juniper, and it has little berries. So this would be what the gin would be made out of, it's the berries. You could do that with all junipers, but I don't recommend eating junipers fresh. they have some pretty potent chemicals in them. Some junipers have traditionally been used as an abortive. Anyway, this juniper doesn't have scale-like needles. Oh, an owl! Wow. It doesn't have scale-like needles. It has needle-like needles, scale-like leaves. It has needle-like leaves. So the junipers have a little variety in their character, in their leaf types. So come take a close look at the needles and berries of common juniper. I can't help myself, but there's some sea blush over there. So beautiful. We have to go look at it. It's not a tree. Please forgive me. Oh, so beautiful. So a nice springtime wildflower. Sea blush often grows on sand like this, sand dune sand, but it'll sometimes grow on rocky cliff sides too, on sandstone usually. Often near the coast, and I think that's why they call it sea blush. A new species here, and I'm going to key it out quickly for you. You could follow along on page 28 if you'd like. So 1, we know it's going to be 1A, right? It's obviously an evergreen. So 2, 2A is leaves scale-like, concealing the twig, or 2B leaves needle-like. They're obviously needle-like. 4A, needles in clusters, no. 4B, needles not in clusters, yes. So we go down to 6A, needles stalkless, or 6B is needles stalked. And we can actually see quite, probably a little easier than the other ones, how at the base of the needle there's a little teeny stalk. So these are stalked needles. So that brings us down to 10A or 10B. 10A reads, stalks fall with needles. Seed codes prominent, 3-bract. Well, we know that was Douglas fir, so that's not the case. Or 10B, stalks or part of them remain after the needles fall. Seed cones not as above. Okay. 11A, needles 4-sided, which was the spruce, or 11B, needles 2-sided, not stiff. These are very flat, very 2-sided. So we go 11B, and then below that is 12. So 12A reads needles of equal lengths, apparently alternate, sharp-pointed. Or 12B, needles of different lengths, opposite or spirally arranged and blunt. So the tips of the needles is what we need to focus on. Are they sharp-pointed or are they blunt? And these have sharp-pointed tips, and all the needles are roughly the same length. So that gives us, that makes 12A the right choice. Taxus brevifolia, which is, well, I know what it is, I'm just trying to be dramatic. Drum roll, please. It is the Pacific yew. Where is it? Pacific yew, here we are. Okay, so I'm going to show you some more features of the Pacific yew beyond the needles, and this is a very ethnobotanically significant plant. We'll walk over to the bark. Yew bark has kind of peels and flakes, and I think it looks a little bit sometimes like spruce bark. But yew is a fantastically hard wood, and so it's used traditionally for all sorts of tools and implements. Wedges, they didn't have steel. We would use a steel wedge today to split firewood. Well, traditionally, the Coast Salish and other Northwest Coast peoples used pieces of yew wood as a wedge to drive and split chunks of cedar into planks and stuff like that. It's used for handles, for adzes, and most importantly, I think, is its traditional use as a wood for making bows. So in many Coast Salish languages, the name of the plant can actually be translated as bow plant. And modern medicinal use, and likely a traditional use as well in some places, is the use of yew bark as cancer treatment. So today, Taxol, the breast cancer medicine, is made from yew bark, and it used to be that people harvested that yew bark from the wild, and they were kind of denuding forests of yew trees because they had to cut down the trees to get the bark. But today, yew trees are grown in nurseries to supply the Taxol industry with plant materials. Pop quiz! Identify this tree by its bark. I can't hear you. Ah, nice, you got it. That's right, it is a Sitka spruce. See these potato chip-like flakes? I'm actually kind of hungry. Oh my god, a new tree species! Here above me is one that has leaves that look way different, but it's obviously an evergreen. So if I consult the key really quickly again, I know it's evergreen, so it's 1A. And we go to 2A, leaves scale-like, concealing the twigs. Here we have a scale-like leaf. Alright, so let's key it out a little further. 3A is leaf-covered twigs flattened, or 3B, leaf-covered twigs round or squarish. And these twigs are indeed flattened. They look like somebody has pressed them in a book, and that gives us Thuya plicata, which means...
What a wonderful phrase!
Which means folded. Plicate means folded because the scales look like they've been folded around the twig. Western red cedar is sometimes called the tree of life because it is used for so many different things by Aboriginal peoples here in the northwest coast. Every part of the tree, in fact, is useful. So let's start from the bottom. The roots, like the, oh, you can't see them underneath the ground here, but the roots, like the spruce roots, are tremendously strong and flexible and straight and great for weaving baskets and hats and things of that nature. The bark can be stripped off in sheets and also used for basket weaving. The needles are sometimes used to lay things on, sort of like you could put them down between layers of seaweed to keep the seaweed from sticking together, for example. The twigs are very flexible and are used in kind of more coarse basket weaving. Say you wanted to make a clam basket or a basket for hauling rocks. You wouldn't want to use a really high quality material that took a long time to harvest. These cedar twigs can be harvested in an instant and woven into a burden basket. And what else? The wood even is tremendously useful, and it splits so easily. So it was split to traditionally make into long planks that are used like shingles for the roof and walls of the traditional big houses. And today it's still used for making canoes and bentwood boxes and totem poles, and it's really valuable commercially for shingles, which is almost essentially the same use as the big planks on a big house for keeping the rain off your house. So that's just about every single part of the tree, as you can see, is useful. Western red cedar. The next tree is here. This is one called grand fir, and I'm not going to key it out, but it looks superficially a bit like the Douglas fir. And one good feature for distinguishing it from Douglas fir is the fact that the needles, instead of kind of coming out around the twig all the way, the needles are two-ranked, which means that they just come out in two different directions. And they have very prominent stomata lines. These are where the needles do gas exchange, so they get the CO2 from the atmosphere that they need to make sugar, and they exhale their oxygen from these little teeny white cells that form the white lines on the bottom of the grand fir needle. Another difference between the grand fir and Douglas fir is how the cones are held on the branches. So this is grand fir, and not to confuse you, but here's a Douglas fir cone. A Douglas fir cone, if this were a Douglas fir, would hang from the branch on the bottom side of the branch. Now the way grand fir cones are found is they're actually upright on the branches. So they would be like this. And grand fir cones are only ever found at the very tops of the trees. And when they they don't fall off the tree whole like Douglas firs. You don't see big piles of grand fir cones under a grand fir tree. Terrible tree to have a pine cone fight under. The grand fir cones fall apart scale by scale up at the very top of the tree, and so you might see the little scales laying on the ground, but you're never going to see a whole cone unless a squirrel has chewed off that cone. And if you find them, they're actually quite big and heavy and would give somebody a black eye if you hit them with it. One last thing about firs. Grand fir is a true fir, and all the true firs have upright cones on the twigs. Douglas fir is not a true fir. And so it and hemlock and many of the other pines have cones that actually hang. So the true firs are separate from most of the rest of the pine family in that they have cones that are upright on the twigs. Beside me here is a mature grand fir, and notice the bark is more of a lighter gray color. It has cracks like Douglas fir, but they're not so deep as a Douglas fir. Grand fir bark is much thinner, and it is not nearly as fire tolerant as the Douglas fir. Grand fir wood is also not quite as strong as the Douglas fir. So if you were to buy at a lumber yard a white 2x4, sometimes they call it white wood, a forester would call that hem fir, and that probably, if it's local, comes from this grand fir. Whereas at a lumber yard, the Douglas fir, you're going to pay a little more for Douglas fir because it's stronger and a better product, and it usually has more of an orange color in the heartwood. One ethnobotanical use of the grand fir that I think is great is you could make tea from the needles. You just steep the needles in some hot water. It doesn't take much, just a clump of needles about that big or something like that to make a pot of tea. And it smells like Christmas trees and has a similar flavor. If you've ever nibbled on your Christmas tree, I guess. I like to mix it with trailing blackberry and licorice fern, some plants that you'll learn about later in this course. So that's all about the grand fir. Pop quiz! What's the bark of this tree tell you?
Tall tree.
It should be screaming, "I'm a Douglas fir! I grow really tall and I have super thick bark that's almost fireproof." Okay, we got another species of tree here. And this one looks way different. The needles are way longer, but let's see what the key has to say. So we know it's an evergreen, so we could skip to 2. Leaves scale-like, concealing the twigs? No. So let's see what 2B says. 2B, leaves needle-like, not concealing twigs. Yes. Okay, now we get to 4. Needles in clusters or needles not in clusters. So if I pull one of these, try and pull off one needle. Oops, actually I did pull off one needle. Look at that, I actually get 2 needles that are connected at the base. So that is a cluster of needles. And then, so needles in cluster, we go to 4A, and then below that we have 5. 5A reads needles in clusters of 5, and 5B reads needles in clusters of 2. So I'll just do another one. Yep, cluster of 2.
Hold it still.
Another cluster of 2. So that was quick. We get to Pinus contorta. And that is, like the name sounds, contorted, sometimes called shore pine or lodgepole pine. Shore pine because it usually is growing pretty near the shore, and the winds will distort the trunk and make it contorted. We're getting near the end of our list of evergreen conifers that are found in the lowlands. And here I have one called western hemlock, or Tsuga heterophylla. And the scientific name actually gives a nice hint as to a good identifying characteristic. Heterophylla means different length needles. Phylla means leaf, and hetero means different. And so if you look closely at these needles, you could see that some are long and some are short. So this tree, western hemlock, has very small cones. and they hang from the underside of the twigs in a similar way to Douglas fir. Now, western hemlock is traditionally used for a couple different things. It has really soft twigs, and so it makes really good bedding. So if you're camping and you forgot your sleeping pad and you need to sleep on the ground, you could get a whole pile of these western hemlock boughs and sleep on top of them, and they'll keep you off the cold ground. The boughs are also great for sticking in the ocean, and there's a fish called herring that deposit their eggs over everything in the spring, this time of the year. And if you put a hemlock bough out in the water when the herring are spawning, the eggs will stick to the hemlock bough, and you could eat the eggs, and eating a few of these needles isn't bad for you. So that's another good traditional use. And the final use that I'd like to mention is the cambium is actually edible from western hemlock. And we have quite a few different species that have edible cambium. I haven't mentioned this yet, but the lodgepole pine that we saw a second ago, the Sitka spruce, and western hemlock, and western white pine, and a number of the hardwood trees that you'll learn in the next field trip. They all have cambium, which is that living layer of tissue between the bark and the wood that is edible. And so it's not eaten so much today. It's used by a couple indigenous groups, more so in the interior than on the coast, but traditionally it used to be used all up and down the coast as a seasonal delicacy food, usually eaten in the early summer or late spring.
Isn't hemlock poisonous?
Oh, some people might ask, like my cameraman brother here, if hemlock is poisonous. Well, we'll talk about this a bit in our unit on taxonomy, but some of the common names that we identify plants with, or call plants by, are a little misleading. So poison hemlock is an herbaceous plant that is very poisonous, whereas western hemlock is a tree that is not poisonous. Another pop quiz. What do we got here? So recognize that the leaves are flat and scale-like rather than needle-like. This is the western red cedar. Nice job. And here's a great look at the bark. The cedar bark is very thin, and it has long cracks in it. So traditionally, and this is a tradition that's still very active today, is that the bark is cut at the base and then peeled, and a long strip will go up the tree, and that's how you get the bark for weaving. It's the inner bark that you use, and we'll actually have a little field trip on, or a unit on weaving towards the end of the term. I want to end with a story that's a Coast Salish story, and it goes like this. A long time ago, there was a giant fire that was raging through the Salish Sea region, and a little mouse was running and running and running, trying to escape the fire. And he came up to the first tree he could find and yelled up into the branches, "Grand Fir, help me, a fire is coming. What should I do?" And the Grand Fir said, "Oh, little mouse, I'm sorry. I'm just a Grand Fir. My bark is thin. I'll probably burn up in this fire. You should seek shelter elsewhere." So the little mouse, he ran and ran and ran. He ran and ran and ran. He ran and ran and ran and ran. Then he came to another tree, and he yelled up to the tree, recognizing the bark features, "Western hemlock, help me, a fire is coming, what should I do?" And western hemlock looked down and said, with his drooping top, looked down and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, little mouse. My bark is also thin. I will surely burn up in this fire. You should seek shelter elsewhere." So the little mouse, he ran and ran, ran and ran, and he came to this tree. And he said, "I haven't learned you yet, but I'm guessing you're a red alder. Help me, what should I do? A fire is coming." And the red alder said, Oh, I'm just a short tree. My branches are dead near the ground. They'll catch on fire and I'll surely burn up. So you should seek shelter elsewhere. So the little mouse, he said, oh, okay, I'm getting tired. And he ran and he ran. He ran and he ran and he ran. And finally, they're getting tired. The little mouse came to this giant tree. Oh my God. Seeing the features of the bark, he said, you must be a Douglas fir. Douglas fir! Help me, a fire is coming, what should I do? And the Douglas fir looked down. Oh, little mouse, I see you down there. Don't fear, my bark is thick. I am fireproof. Climb up high into my branches and call all your brothers and sisters and go out onto the tips of the branches, and there you will find cones, and you could crawl up under the scale of my cones, and there you will find refuge from the fire. So the little mouse, he climbed up the tree and out on the branches and yelled out to his friends, come on, little mice! And they scurried up and followed him, and to this day you can see the hind legs and the tail of all the little mice that are hiding underneath the scales of the Douglas fir cone. I want to leave you with a story that's from this area here, and it's called the Maiden of Deception Pass. And this is a story that is traditional to the Samish, and I think the Swinomish and the Skagit peoples. And rather than tell it myself, I want to allow those peoples to tell it themselves. And so I'll provide a link, and I encourage you to watch a video where they share that story. And this is a story about a very beautiful woman that walked into the water while harvesting shellfish and reached deeper and deeper and encountered something unexpected that changed her life forever.